As much as the PhD process is often obfuscated and desperately in need of better communication and things being made clearer, for the most part, those of us who do an arts and humanities PhD know what we're going into. We'll spend a period of time reading, writing, potentially in archives if relevant. The vast majority of this time, we know, will be spent alone. This process we've inherited from decades of PhDs before us who, mostly, were researching single, relatively contained things. This isn't to say they don't have depth. I started as a Shakespeare specialist. I'm clearly not saying Shakespeare isn't worth it as a field of study. But if you were, for example, an English literature PhD, you studied a piece or pieces of English literature using English literature techniques. In a world where our creative arts are increasingly based in transmedia, where novelists often actively aspire to film deals, poets make videos their medium as well as text, and the definition of literature has vastly exploded, a PhD today can look really different to what it would have done 10 years ago. I very vividly remember picking my A-levels 20 years ago and being told not to take media studies, that isn't a proper subject and Cambridge won't take it seriously. The joke is, of course, on them because I didn't get into Cambridge and my PhD is essentially in media studies. Which leads me introducing what my work is actually about and why it's relevant to today's Salon. I am a part-time third-year PhD, technically in the School of English on an English PhD, but more accurately my field is the medical and health humanities. My thesis examines the affective transfer of the embodied experience of madness. You will find through things today I'll interchange between different terms for madness. I work from a mad studies perspective, so I primarily use madness as a reclaimed term. However, when doing public-facing things for ease of communication, I'll often use the term mental illness. I very much encourage people to use the terms they choose that best describe either themselves or the experience of the people they're working with. Because I'm looking at how the embodied experience is evoked, I'm specifically looking at interactive media types. If you've heard me talk around the university in the past few years, it was probably about video games. At present, I'm working on studying fan fiction, and subsequently I'll be moving on to look at role-playing games and interactive or visual novels, also known as otome. This is, as medical humanities work often is, a really very transdisciplinary affair. I definitely do draw on my background in more traditional literary and performance studies, but due to the focus of my work on MAD experiences, I'm increasingly looking to fields born of activism like disability studies and MAD studies. I give you all of this introduction to both explain my work, but also explain just how little studying or work I've done in anything that would even slightly involve any kind of data. When I first started studying the medical humanities in late 2019, I found myself quickly encountering medical documents. These made me very abruptly aware of just how much I didn't understand. I would flee from any mention of a p-value in horror and hide in the written-up summary at the end of medical studies. This isn't strictly a bad thing, it should be noted, but there is definitely a disbenefit in not understanding every part of the study you're looking at, especially if, like me, you're studying a group of people who are frequently persecuted and misrepresented by modern Western medicine. But when I started my PhD and started to really dig into existing scholarship around madness and fanfiction especially, I encountered an issue. At that point, pretty much no one was working on it. This is something that's definitely changed in the past 3 years and is continuing to change, but even now, fan studies suffers from the fact that disability and chronic illness often go forgotten. Even large-scale demographic surveys in fan studies have historically not included disability. The largest fanfiction archive today, which I focused my thesis on, is the Archive of Our Own, or AO3. And when a census of AO3 users was conducted in 2013, disability wasn't included, but it will be in this year's 10-year anniversary repeat of the census. I've now met many scholars, especially PhD and early career scholars, who are making disability and fandom their focus. Nonetheless, the data that I knew I needed to prove my argument about how fanfiction helps to create a collective narrative of madness just didn't exist. Now, amongst my many chronic illnesses is that I am chronically independent. I don't like asking people to do things for me, and given the opportunity, I'll learn an entire new skill myself rather than ask someone to do something. I really wish this was hyperbole. So, when faced with the fact that the data I needed didn't exist, I didn't pause to think about how ridiculous the idea was. I just decided to gather it myself. To be honest, I didn't even understand how weird this was until it was pointed out at my 2-year review after I was most of the way through the process that it is in fact a bit strange. It was also suggested at that review that other people would benefit from hearing about the process I went through to do it, which is why we're all here today. Now, the first thing I did when I was preparing for this study, before I'd even thought about what kind of study I wanted to do, was I looked at what training I could do to help prepare me. In going through my PhD myself and mentoring first-year PhDs, I've discovered just how hard it can be to find what support is available at the university. A lot of the time, it's not that the support doesn't exist, it's just that you have to dig through the maze that is the university website to find it. Fortunately, by this point, having done my master's at Kent as well, I had a bit more of an idea, so I looked through what the graduate school had to offer, I looked through digests and emails I had been sent, and I did find a good amount of training relating to working with data. The problem was that it was too high level. It was designed for people who'd already had someone tell them the very basics, like what a p-value is, who now wanted to learn Python or do different kinds of modelling. So what I ended up doing was going away and using a third-party training website. I chose Udemy, but there's many of them, and I took 2 different courses. These did cost me money. It wasn't a vast amount, I think each was under £50. One of them was on qualitative data, and one of them was on quantitative data. Now, these courses were very basic. They didn't presume I knew anything at all about statistics, which was necessary because the last time I took maths was at GCSE level. Whilst they didn't go in depth on any particular methodologies, they did introduce me to what several of the big methodologies are, and more importantly, taught me about designing the kind of study I wanted to do. A lot of these very early design decisions are easily made when you are a sole person doing a PhD. You're most likely not going to have funding, so you can instantly rule out a lot of the options. It became very clear to me early on that the best option I had was to do a survey. This fits really well in fan studies, where surveys are one of the main ways of gathering data about fans. Fans are very online, and I had a lot of examples to look at. So this was the next thing I started doing. I not only looked at these surveys for examples, I read accounts from other fan studies academics about the work they'd done, I spoke to some non-academic experts in fan stats to help me work out what I needed to do to design the survey, how I should do it, what I needed to think about. With all this in mind, I designed a survey where the first portion collected demographic data with a special focus on disability and mental illness, and the second portion collected information about fan practices around mental illness and fan fiction. This second section was almost entirely open text write-in answers and formed the qualitative part of the study, which was also the bulk of it. When I designed these questions, I was primarily thinking about my own thesis, but I was also thinking about how the data I gathered could be used by fan studies as a whole. The decision to ultimately make my data open is an important one because it has an effect on the next part of the process, which is ethical approval. Even knowing that it would complicate things, having my data open was really important to me because I wanted other people like me to be able to make use of it, because it's part of the tradition in fan studies and fan stats to do this, and because the university does actually also encourage open data. This design process is often obviously super important, and I thought a lot about whether I was going to talk about how I picked the questions in more detail, but ultimately it's going to be so unique to whatever you're doing. I don't think there's value in me devoting time to it that could be used in talking about other parts of the process. So I'm going to leave it at that, but you're obviously welcome to ask me more questions about it later. By this point, I had spoken to my supervisor a good amount about what I wanted to do. Now, I will say here I'm very lucky that my supervisor wasn't just aware of the ethical process, she had been part of the approval committee. So she was able to talk me through exactly what I needed to do, link me to all the relevant forms and resources, and advise me on what would and wouldn't be possible. I would really advise, if this is something you want to do and your supervisor doesn't have that expertise, reach out to someone who does and who can help you that way. The Central Research and Ethics Advisory Group, or CREAG as you may see it written, are super lovely and helpful. They want you to be able to do your research, and even when I had really weird and specific queries, they were able to help me. But before we get into that, we first need to talk about, how do you know if you even need ethical approval? So your first point of call is going to be something called the Ethics Review Checklist for Research. To find this checklist, honestly, just Google CREAG University of Kent and you'll find all of their resources. This checklist covers all the situations that would make your study require ethical approval. It's a big list where if you answer yes to any of the questions, then you need ethical approval. It is possible to still not be sure, in which case I would recommend you either email CREAG directly or speak to your school ethics rep. I will note at this point, the public lists of those reps often aren't up to date, so you might need to check with your supervisor or another member of staff if you're not sure who is. For me and my study, I checked 3 boxes. First, there would be potential discussion of sensitive topics. Secondly, that I would be collecting material of a sensitive, personal, biographical, medical, social, or physiological nature. And thirdly, that it would involve vulnerable groups. This last one for me wasn't so much that I would be studying mad people, but more that I wanted to include the ages 13 to 18 in my survey, because we know from other fan studies work that the majority of fans begin reading and writing fan fiction during that age bracket. So, having decided that I needed to get ethical approval, my next step was to do the full application form and all of the supporting documents. This is where it got really difficult. Essentially, to complete this form, I had to have my survey so nailed down that I could have launched it the next day. I needed the full research proposal, a complete participant information sheet, that's generally the info page you see at the start of surveys, the consent questions, the actual survey questions, and any advertising material, just to name some of them. Don't underestimate how much work this is. This is a ton of work. It's so much work that I've been advised to include all of these documents as appendices to my thesis so they can demonstrate the very real and extensive contribution and effort made. Now, some of these things came really easily. Obviously, I knew what my research proposal was, I just needed to write it out. At this point, I had my questions already designed. Advertising material for me was just writing example social media posts like tweets and TikTok scripts. The difficulty came when I needed to write my participant information sheet and answer one particular question in the full form. Is your study GDPR compliant? If you just saw anyone in the room shudder, that's because they've worked with GDPR before. So GDPR, for those who don't know, is a data protection scheme that came into the UK and EU in 2016. Its purpose is to ensure that you retain control of your data, that you know who's going to control your data if you give it away, and you know what they're going to do with that data, and you have the ability to redact that data if you so choose. My first big mistake with GDPR was that I tried to read the official legal document. Don't do that. More seriously, if you want to and it helps you, then you can, but it may just overwhelm and confuse you. The most useful thing I did in understanding if and how I needed to be GDPR compliant was to look up things like GDPR for researchers, GDPR in surveys, things like that. I found several guides written by various institutions in the UK and abroad that helped me to understand what GDPR compliance meant for me. My survey collected personal data. It asked people about their race, gender, sexuality, disability status, etc. Many of these are what's called protected characteristics. This is basically anything that the Equality Act covers and generally means heightened scrutiny of what you're doing with the data. However, I was actively not collecting anything identifying. I didn't take names, IP addresses, emails. Even when I asked people for their location, it was done essentially by continent. This meant two things in terms of GDPR. One, it meant the main thing I needed to do was make it clear to everyone at the point of consent, so in this information sheet, exactly what their data was going to be used for, who I was and who I worked for, and what sort of data I would be collecting. Two, it meant that I could bypass the right for people to have their data revoked. This was applicable for me because I had no way of identifying the person. The data was fully anonymised, and although people could technically put anything in the write-in questions, they were instructed not to leave identifying information, and that in the instance that someone did, it would be redacted from the data prior to publishing. As part of the review process, I was also asked to disaggregate the demographic data from the write-in questions in the publicly available format. The aggregated version is available by request, but the two different data sets are randomized, so you can't easily line the two up together. These provisions turned out to be necessary, as someone did in fact give me their phone number, writing, "I'm too high to type clearly, but I have a lot to say. Please text me if you have any further questions." So for me, GDPR ended up just being a case of making my information sheet clear, but it could be very different for other studies depending on the kind of information being gathered and how. My other main hurdle with these forms was regarding collecting data from minors. In the UK, you can actually give your own consent from age 16 and above. It's from 13 to 15 that you need guardian consent. To fulfill that in the actual survey, all I had to do was include questions in the consent form that covered this. I also made sure that the survey would kick out anyone who passed the consent questions, but then in the age question said they were under 13, and any no to any of the consent questions also did this. One thing that initially had me concerned and confused was that my survey was being taken by people across the world, and obviously consent law varies very differently across different countries. This was one of the instances where I contacted the CREAG for advice, and in my case, don't take this as general gospel, but in my case they said I just needed to worry about UK law. Other than that, I just had to very strongly justify the need to gather data from minors in my research proposal and in questions on the full form. One last thing to talk about with this application form is that if you're doing a survey, you need to know what you're using to do it. There's a ton of different survey websites and they all have different pros and cons. If you're looking at those, you're going to have to go through them yourself based on what your survey is like. I personally picked Google Forms. There are downsides to Google Forms. It has some problems on mobile, which obviously is an accessibility issue, but it's pretty good with screen readers and other vision adjustments, and it gathered the data automatically into a spreadsheet, which was ideal for me. I also personally use Google for all my cloud storage, so it was just handy. Most importantly, it doesn't cost anything, and because I didn't know how many respondents I was going to get, I couldn't go for anything that charged you money based on the number of respondents. When you put in an ethics application, it can be just accepted, it can be sent back for major changes, it can be sent back for minor changes, or it can be outright rejected. I was asked to make major changes. Firstly, in terms of the disaggregation of the published data I talked about earlier, and also to make my consent questions separate and clearer. Now, I'm very easily upset. I got really upset at the time that it had been sent back, especially that it needed major revisions, but I did them and I sent things back in and it was all completely fine. I also got some of the formatting wrong in places when I first submitted, but they were just lovely about that too. They really want to help you do your research. After that, everything went really quite quickly, because once I got approval, that was it. I could publish the survey, and I did the following week. Now, in terms of syndicating my survey, I obviously wanted it to reach fandom spaces. In the months leading up to this, I'd been curating a Tumblr, increasing my presence in Fan Studies Twitter, and also starting a TikTok. Now, I have the benefit that I've previously worked as a community manager online. I've got a diploma in social media management. That's another course I went off and did so I could do things myself. And so I have an idea of how to do all of these things. If you're less experienced, that may be something you want to study up on, or as I did, go and take a course in it. My survey was open for 3 weeks. In the first 2 weeks, I gained about 200 responses. And on the second weekend, it was shared by the Fansplaining podcast, which I had previously guested on. Fansplaining is one of the biggest fan studies podcasts and has a really good reach, and that led to my response numbers shooting up to 488 by the time the survey closed a few days later. It's really important, if you want a good number of respondents, to make sure you have the reach to do that. In addition to reaching out to the podcast to have them share it, I also had a large number of other fan studies academics share it, and it was shared widely on Tumblr. You need to make sure these shares go to the audiences that you want taking your survey though, otherwise you could send it to 10,000 people, and if they're not relevant, it's not going to help you at all. Of course, things don't end the day your survey closes. The first thing I did after taking care of my data protection tasks was look into publishing the data. After reviewing my options, I ended up publishing it on the Harvard Dataverse. This is a free data repository where you can limit the access, which worked great for me with my aggregated and disaggregated versions. Anyone can go and download the disaggregated version, and then anyone can make a request for the aggregated files. It also gave me my first DOI, which made me super proud and was a really nice form of proof of all the work I'd done. I then shared this link on the social media accounts where I'd syndicated the survey itself. I'd held off deciding how I was going to analyse the data until I knew how many respondents I had. If I had only a few, I reasoned, then it would make much less sense to try and do any kind of coding with the data. For me, the idea of needing to learn Python or other kinds of data coding like R weren't worrying to me. I've worked in a form of software development before and have some experience in coding, even if I'm by no means any kind of developer. However, I had a bunch of personal emergencies around this time that meant that facing the data became very overwhelming to me. In the end, what I did to begin with was literally just read all the responses. I'd already done this as part of checking it for identifying information, but on the second pass, I took my time much more. I made notes as if I was analysing a novel. This close text analysis is actually what forms the large part of my chapter. Ultimately, at this point, I've spent a lot of time on this chapter. If I'm honest, I'm a bit behind where I wanted to be at this point. And although I am indeed skilled at picking up skills I don't have, going into learning data analysis properly is probably a bit more than I can realistically manage without extensive guidance and within a very limited amount of time. The one exception I'm potentially making to that, which I'm working on right now, is a kind of analysis called topic modelling. This uses a tool called Top2Vec, which is TOP, the number 2, VEC. And it has some feeding regarding keywords to make it then take a data set and map linked words into topics. It can create word maps based around themes, which helps you to see patterns you might not have otherwise. It's very much a jumping off point rather than a source of any final analysis, which I'm hoping to use to guide my existing close reading of the data. I was taught how to use this method at a workshop at the recent FSNNA, that's Fan Studies Network North America conference, and I had a great deal of fun with it. It feels accessible to me, doesn't require a lot of learning on my part. I have the advantage also that I now have contacts who know how to use it. What you choose to do with your data will of course depend on your project. I would advise looking into it earlier than I did and planning out your time better, but hopefully you won't be dealing with a ton of personal crises whilst also trying to analyse your data. I will say if you do decide to go the way of data analysis tools, make sure to look up what software is available to you through the institution. The licenses we're offered extend far beyond just Office 365 and include software like Anaconda, NVivo and SPSS Statistics. There's also software in the Software Finder that can help you with learning to use these things. I did play with them a little bit, but ultimately found it was going to be too much work to learn how to use them. To bring us to a conclusion, I want to talk about how much of a difference this made to my thesis. Because you may very well, very understandably, have listened to all of this and concluded, that sounds like too much work. And for your project it might be. I have the privilege and benefit of having some existing relevant skills and knowledge. Being part-time and not working alongside that meant that I was able to make room for things like training when my health was doing a bit better. I've also had the benefit of a supervisor with relevant institutional knowledge. Your situation is going to be just that, your situation. What I can tell you is that my chapter wouldn't have anywhere near the power it does without the data I gathered. Although this presentation hasn't focused at all on the actual content of that data, I'd like to leave you with a few quotes from respondents that show just how much fanfiction about mental illness means to people, and how important it is that this data has been gathered to serve as a record of those testimonials. One person said that fanfiction helped them to feel a sense of community, feel like I'm not alone, see a broader worldview of my illness than I would have if I only had my experience to learn from. Another said, "It has literally saved my life. During my last depressive episode, reading fanfic about experiences like mine kept my suicidal ideation from going any further." And finally, one person said, "If I can imagine a happy ending for my characters, it's easier to imagine a happy ending for myself." So although all of this work and all of this effort was a lot and very stressful and has put me behind on my chapter, I would absolutely do it over and over again to get all of the incredible things that my respondents sent, because I think it's really going to make a difference not just to my thesis, but also to the field as a whole.